time, certainly. But it is nevertheless, I think, to some extent, a product of the Galuth. And here I wish to quote from the Perush of Rashbam. Excuse me. Rashbam, of course, was Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, the grandson of Rashi, the older brother of Rabbeinu Tam. In his Perush on the Torah, in Parashat Mishpatim, this is in Sefer Shemoth, Perek Kaf Gimel, chapter 23, Pasuk Tet Zayin, Pasuk 16. In the previous Pasuk, I should begin with the Pasuk before that, Pasuk Tet Well, or even Yudalad, I'll begin. It says, Shalosh Regalim Tahogli Bashana. You shall celebrate 3 Regalim, 3 festivals during the course of the year. At Hag HaMasoth Tishmor, the Hag of Masoth of Pesach, Shiv'at Yomim, Tochal Masoth Kasher Sewithicha LeMoed Chodesh HaAviv. You shall celebrate this festival for 7 days. You shall eat Masoth and not Hames. LeMoed Chodesh HaAviv, at the time of the Aviv. Literally, normally we would translate this as the spring. But in fact, the word Aviv, as Rashi already points out, the essential and fundamental meaning of the term Aviv is the barley harvest, which at that time begins to ripen and is called Aviv. The ripening barley is referred to in Hebrew as Aviv. And that's why that time of year is referred to as Aviv, the spring season, because that's when the barley begins to ripen. As Rashi says here, Shatuvuah mitmal'eth bo be'ibeha. In other words, the stalks of grain in the field begin to become full and begin to ripen. Ibeha. Ibeha means its fruit or its produce. And the word Ibeha is and Aviv are essentially the same word. The pasuk continues, at this time, Kivo yasata mimisraim, at this time you left Misraim, Ulo yereu fanai rekam, and at this time you shall come before me in the Mikdash with korbanot, etc. That's the first of the 3 regalim. The second, Wahav hakasir bikure ma'asecha. The second is the festival of the harvest. This begins at Shavuot. Asher tizra b'sadeh, that which you have sown in the field, which is now can now be harvested. So you see, the Torah speaks here about the second of the 3 regalim, Hag HaKasir, Shavuot. Here it's not referred to as Shavuot; it's referred to as Hag HaKasir, the festival of the harvest, because at that time the wheat becomes harvestable. It is now ready for harvest. And the third regel, Wahav HaAsif, the festival of the ingathering of all the produce, B'set Hashana, the end of the year, B'ospichat Ma'asecha min hasadeh, when you gather in all the fruit of your labors of the year, you gather them into the home, because now, this time, shortly after Sukkot, usually the rainy season begins in Eretz Yisrael. At that time, the grain that was harvested during the summer months has to be brought in from the field and stored in a dry place, otherwise it will be ruined, and the field will become wet and rot. And the same is true of the various fruits, of the trees, etc., which ripen during the summer months, each in its own time. All this has to be gathered and brought into storage for the winter months and for the coming year. So we see clearly from these Pesukim that these 3 regalim are all very much connected to the agricultural cycle in Eretz Yisrael. Briefly, the agricultural cycle is as follows. Around this time of year, even in the month of Tishrei, in which we are now, usually the following month, the month of Heshwan, is the time for sowing the fields with wheat and barley. Around that time, or shortly after that time, the rains are expected to begin to fall, and cause those seeds to sprout. And then, as we said before, around Pesach time, the barley is ready, can be harvested. That's around the time of Pesach. That's why it's called Chodesh HaAviv, the month of the Aviv, of the ripened barley. Second Hag refers to Hag HaKasir, the festival of the harvest of the wheat, which is the main and the most essential crop. And then Hag HaAsif, the festival which rounds out the agricultural year and cycle in Eretz Yisrael, gathering in all of the various crops and produce. And therefore, the Rashbam, in his Perush on the Torah, he writes as follows. I will read and I will translate. Hag HaAsif, Hag HaSukkoth, B'sha'at HaAsif Asher Mala'u HaGranoth. In other words, at the time of Sukkoth, all the storage houses, all the silos, etc., are full of grain, and also the grape harvest has been brought in by this time, has been harvested. Often the grapes have already been pressed into wine. And all these various products of Eretz Yisrael, the Shivat HaMinim, are all now in abundance. Rashbam says, "V'siwa hakathu," and the Torah commands us, "Leshev b'Sukkoth l'zikaron," to dwell in Sukkoth as a reminder. A reminder of what? We all know that in the Talmud we find a discussion between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, whether the Sukkoth are a reminder of the physical, actual Sukkoth that our forefathers built in the desert to protect themselves from the desert heat and sun after leaving Mitzrayim, or whether it refers to Ananei Kavod, whether it refers to the clouds that Hashem caused to dwell over them and protect them from the sun. But the Rashbam, who is always aiming to understand the Peshat, the simple meaning and thrust of the Torah, the Rashbam says, the Sukkoth are there to remind us of the following. Ki b'midbar yashuvu b'ohalim. In the Midbar, we lived either in tents or in Sukkoth. V'lo haya lehem karka, and we did not have land. We did not have a fertile agricultural land. In other words, we lived hand to mouth. We did not live in a state of abundance and plenty. V'lo dagan v'thirosh v'yizhar. We did not have grain or wine or olive oil in abundance, as they later had upon entering Eretz Yisrael. Having entered Eretz Yisrael, having conquered Eretz Yisrael, they now were in possession of a beautiful, fertile land, which was blessed with these Shivat HaMinim, these various types of produce, something which they did not enjoy immediately upon leaving Mitzrayim. And thus they shall recall their sojourn in the desert, and will thank Hashem that now they are no longer in the desert, now they are in Eretz Yisrael. The Rashbam sums up what he's driving at. He says, so therefore we see all these three festivals, says the Rashbam, they are all connected to the produce of the land of Eretz Yisrael. Aviv, Chasir, Asif. The time of the barley, the ripening barley harvest, the wheat harvest, and the other produce, and the gathering in of all of the above. So the Rashbam, we see very clearly, connects Sukkoth to the reality of Am Yisrael living in Eretz Yisrael, living in its land and enjoying the fruits thereof. And what we're really supposed to be noting at this time, according to the Rashbam and according to the simple meaning of the Pesukim, is that we are living in such a place, in such a land, which produces all this plenty for us, something which we did not have when we were in Mitzrayim, and we did not have in the desert, And these regalim stress this reality and remind us 3 times a year of how blessed we are. Now, when you live in Eretz Yisrael and you live that agricultural cycle and you are aware of these realities around you, you do not have to come up with any additional reason for celebrating at that time of year. The beginning of the wheat harvest, which is the most essential crop from which we produce bread, etc., which is the most staple of foods. One doesn't need any further explanation why we should be celebrating, why we should be thanking Hashem. When living in other countries of the world where the agricultural cycle is different, where the seasons are different, where the crops are different, then perhaps it is not at all so obvious why we are celebrating at this particular time of the year. And that is, I think, why increasingly over time, Chag HaShavuot was connected to and identified with Matan Torah, exclusively with Matan Torah. There's nothing wrong at all, as we said, connecting Matan Torah to Shavuot, but in fact, it's only a part of the overall picture, and it's not even necessarily the precise day of Matan Torah. It's not misleading, but it does deflect our attention perhaps from another aspect of the Chag, which we should also be cognizant. With regards to Sukkoth, the additional phrase of Zman Simchatenu, which is added according to the Nusach of Bavel, and curiously I would say in this case is not mentioned at all in the Nusach of Eretz Yisrael, which is consistent in not adding any additional descriptive phrases to each of these Chagim. In this case, that addition, I think, is very much in place, and one would perhaps expect it to be mentioned in the Nusach of Eretz Yisrael, because again, it is perhaps not so obvious to a Jew living outside Eretz Yisrael, divorced from the realities, the agricultural cycle, the weather patterns of Eretz Yisrael. It is perhaps not so obvious why it is Zman Simchatenu, the time of our rejoicing. Imagine, for example, a Jew trying to perform the mitzvah of living in a sukkah for 7 days, which ideally means eating and sleeping in a sukkah at the very least, and essentially should be doing almost everything one can in a sukkah. Imagine a Jew trying to do this in the frozen plains of the Ukraine or Belarus or White Russia or some other clime where the mitzvah of sukkah is really almost impossible to perform. I'm sure that many of you are fully aware, as I am, having grown up to a certain age in Chutz La'aretz, that, for example, sleeping in a sukkah is unheard of, essentially, in almost any country outside of Eretz Yisrael, for the very simple and obvious reason that in most climates it is not possible to do so. Rain is frequent, very often it is too cold. It is simply not conducive to the mitzvah of sukkah. Essentially, the only country, almost the only country on the planet where it is feasible, usually, to sleep in a sukkah is Eretz Yisrael. It lends itself to this mitzvah, particularly. And if one doesn't, one is not aware of the agricultural cycle of Eretz Yisrael, one will probably not, and one is sitting freezing in one's sukkah, one is unlikely to immediately identify with the term Zman Simchatenu. But if one thinks in terms of Jews living in Eretz Yisrael, living the agricultural, climatic reality of Eretz Yisrael, who have just gathered in all the crops, all the fruits of their labor over the preceding year, and able to except for the occasional possibility of rain, which also can happen in Eretz Yisrael, true, but it's fairly rare. It's not the norm. Sitting in their sukkah, enjoying their time in the sukkah. The weather is usually quite clement enough for that, and even sleeping in a sukkah is usually possible. The description Zman Simchatenu is entirely appropriate and entirely reasonable and readily understood. So what the Rashbam really is telling us, what the Torah is telling us, is that like so many aspects of the Torah, to be fully experienced and understood and appreciated, it can only be done really in a truly authentic manner in Eretz Yisrael. And the Hagim should always connect us to this reality of Eretz Yisrael. It is when we are distant and divorced from that reality that we tend to come up with other explanations or other ideas which essentially are there to fill in the vacuum. And that's, I think, why we find the concept of ushpizin and other unusual concepts which come about at a much later time. These things were introduced, I believe, to insert some dimension of meaning or experience and significance to the Chag, which was missing frequently in the real world experience of Jews living in the Galuth. So it is always correct that we focus on the authentic and original intention of the Hagim and appreciate them as they were intended by Hashem Noten Torah. That is, in essence, what I wish to speak about this evening. And if there are questions of people who are listening in, I'm happy to address some of those questions.
Can I ask you a question? What about?
Hello, yes?
Hello, hi, it's Joshua here.
Shalom.
Hello, how are you?
Baruch Hashem.
Good. Can I ask about Shemini Atzeret, please?
Sure.
I wanted to know if there were a minyan for a Machon Shilo minyan on Shemini Atzeret, as I understand there has been in the past. What would the Kriyat HaTorah be, and what would the Haftarah be, and would there be Hakafot?
Well, this is it's an interesting question. The truth is the question does not pertain only to Shemini Atzeret, or as it is also known as Simchat Torah, which is also a perfect example of what we've been discussing now. It really pertains, one could ask this question with regards to the entire year. Let me explain. The original minhag, the original practice, reading the Torah on a weekly basis and on an annual basis was the annual cycle was not the original format of this mitzvah. This was developed in Bavel at a slightly later time, as the Talmud itself describes in a couple of places. That in Eretz Yisrael, it says they read the Torah or they complete the Torah every 3 years. In other sources, we see that the more precise figure is 3.5 years. So every 7 years, every Shemitah, they completed the Torah twice in Eretz Yisrael, which means that the Torah reading on a weekly basis was considerably shorter, which we could discuss at length. I don't know if this is the time and the place, but there are certainly some advantages to having a shorter Torah reading. On the other hand, if one wants to complete the Torah annually, the entire Torah, then one has to have a longer Torah reading. And the Minhag in Bavel grew up in such a way that the Torah was completed annually, and the day on which this was done became known as Simchat Torah for this reason. Because the Jews, of course, naturally are happy and joyous that they have been zocheh to read the Torah, to complete the Torah one more year, one more cycle. And they express this joy in various ways, by means of hakafot, dancing, celebrating, having a kiddush, after davening or before davening or in the middle of davening, what have you. These are all expressions of normal, intuitive simcha of the Jewish people when it comes to celebrating their connection to the Torah. But it is clearly a fact that this was not the case in Eretz Yisrael in ancient times. Of course, you have to keep in mind also that in Chutz La'aretz, where to this day Yom Tov is celebrated for 2 days, you have Sukkoth, which lasts 9 days, and Simchat Torah is the 9th day, and is a separate day from Shemini Aseret. So you have Shemini Aseret and you have Simchat Torah, 2 separate days. And you can also therefore divide the various things that you're trying to say and complete and achieve in the Beit Knesset. You can divide that between 2 separate days. And this is what we find in the Zohar. In the Zohar, it discusses the 9 days of the Chag of Sukkoth. A clear indication where the Zohar was authored, and describes the 9th day of Simchat Torah. But this 9th day did not exist in Eretz Yisrael. In fact, it doesn't exist to this day. Because the reality in Chutz La'aretz was 9 days, the 9th day of which was called Simchat Torah, to this day in Eretz Yisrael, to this very day, most people, I think it's fair to say, refer to Shemini Aseret, which is the original name of the day, by the term Simchat Torah. It's a fact, it's a matter of habit. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong. Of course, there's nothing wrong with completing the Torah according to the annual cycle. I said there are advantages and disadvantages to that system, which we can go into if people are interested. But there's nothing wrong with that, and it is also possible to imagine doing things differently. If there were to be a regular minyan of a sibur, of a community of people who wanted to do things according to the ancient system of Eretz Yisrael, reading the Torah, shall we say, every 3.5 years, then that could be done. And one imagines in that case, if there was such a regular minyan that worked in that way over a period of years, they would cover the Torah, but wouldn't necessarily end and begin at the end of Sukkoth. So if there were to be a minyan in a few days' time, and due to the current situation in Israel with the lockdown and other realities, that is not a possibility. And for other reasons, it's complicated. But if that were to be a possibility, then it would depend, seeing that we haven't got, at this point in time, a community that functions in that way. It would have to be discussed by the tzibur, what they want to do, how they wish to conduct themselves. Because when it comes to such decisions, it's the will of the majority of the tzibur that should decide, as it is with many other considerations. For example, if most of the Sibur wants a certain person to be the Shliach Sibur on Rosh Hashanah, and the minority want another person to be the Shliach Sibur, you go by the majority of the Sibur. And the same would apply here.
Thank you, Harav.
One of the Shiur students here has a question for you.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask you about the weight of the mitzvot in the Torah, because I understand that not all of them have equal weight, and there are differing opinions.
I'm sorry. I'm going to ask you to begin again. Perhaps get closer to the microphone. I could not hear you very well.
I think there's something wrong with our connection up here during the Shiur, kind of in gargle, but in the chat. Let's see.
I'm sorry. I have not been able to follow you thus far.
Can you hear us now?
Are you near the microphone? Can you speak clearly and slowly into the microphone? Hello?
Maybe you could type it into the chat.
Possibly, or perhaps if there's, I'm not sure if I can see the chat, or can I? Let's see. Yes, I can see a chat now. Yes. If someone wants to type into the chat, I can see the chat now. Anybody else?
Shalom, Lulav. This is Yitzchak.
Shalom Yitzchak.
You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I was wondering, since you say that we should be waving the Lulav on the first day of Sukkot, which falls on a Shabbat.
Yes.
And since most people aren't doing this now,
yes,
how would you say we go about that? Because I guess we can't go into a synagogue with a Lulav.
No, I definitely would not recommend that.
Yeah.
Because anything that is going to cause mahaloketh must be avoided. It says in the Mishnah in Masechet Pesachim, even if something is correct, but it's going to cause mahaloketh, generally it should be avoided. At this point in time, therefore, what I have said to people who have asked me is to do so at home, in the privacy of their own home. At such time, again, when there is a community that wishes to behave in that way as a community, then it will be possible to do so. As the Mishnah describes explicitly, that people would bring their lulavim to the Beit Knesset Erev Shabbat, before Shabbat, and in the morning they would come and find their lulavim there waiting for them, and they would carry on. They would do what has to be done. But it's not possible to do this where the community is not united around such a practice.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Hi, this is Meir. Going just a little, maybe addition to that question. So if we cannot go into shul, maybe you could answer personally. What did you happen to do on the Shabbat? Did you possibly wave your lulav in your own sukkah or at home? Or
that is precisely what I did. Yes. Some years ago, I was able to organize a minyan when I lived in Yerushalayim. I was able to organize a minyan of some of my talmidim in Yerushalayim, and we had a minyan where we did this. This was in my home and in my sukkah. To this year, this was not possible, so I did as exactly as you said. Yes.
Thank you.
Wait, there was a question someone posted in the chat. I could read it. It says, which mitzvot, in your view, have greater weight than others? Which have the greatest weight? That was someone was trying to ask that before.
I see the question, but I'm not sure I understand the question. In general, the Torah is not a supermarket of mitzvot. We don't pick and choose. We are required to do all the mitzvot that pertain to us. we know that there are certain mitzvot which are more severe or more carry a greater penalty than others. The Rambam writes in his Perush on the Mishnah that the severity of an isur, of a prohibition of the Torah, can be judged according to the penalty that comes with it. In terms of positive mitzvot, well, there are certain mitzvot which Hazal specifically pointed to as being fundamental and in many ways encapsulating all of the Torah. One of those mitzvot is the mitzvah of Shabbat, of keeping Shabbat. Chazal say that Shabbat shekula keneged kol mitzvot. The keeping of Shabbat is equal in weight to all of the mitzvot, because the mitzvah of Shabbat, which of course also carries a very heavy penalty, the transgression of Shabbat, Has Shalom. The mitzvah of Shabbat is an affirmation of our understanding and our awareness of the fact that there is a creator, Yesh Borei La'olam, and he created all that exists, and everything is within his power. He is omniscient and omnipresent and omnipotent. Another mitzvah that Hazal make a similar statement, with regards to which Chazal make a similar statement, is the mitzvah of Sisith. They speak about Sisith being also Shekula Keneged Kol mitzvot, because the mitzvah of Sisith comes to remind us of all the other mitzvot. A further mitzvah that Chazal makes such a statement, with regards to which Chazal makes such a statement, is the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, and dwelling in Eretz Yisrael, which, and this connects to what we said earlier about the Shlosha Ruchalim, that all of the Torah is essentially predicated on and intended for the Jewish people living in Eretz Yisrael, and everything else needs to be understood as being abnormal and not according to the original intention of the Torah. And therefore we find in the Sifrei that when several great Chachamim, due to Roman persecution, had to flee from Eretz Yisrael at a certain period in time, when they reached the borders of Eretz Yisrael, as they were leaving Eretz Yisrael, they sat down on the ground and rendered their clothes and wept, because they had to leave. They were forced to leave Eretz Yisrael. And there it says in the Sifrei, from here we see that Shekula, Yeshivat Eretz Yisrael, Keneged Kol HaMitzvot, that the mitzvah of dwelling in Eretz Yisrael is equal to all the mitzvot combined. Again, because it is an essential foundation, and it's basically the assumption on which the Torah is based. One more mitzvah in connection with which Chazal make a similar statement is of course the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. We all know the Mishnah and Masechet Pe'ah with Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. The study of Torah again is a fundamental and a prerequisite for being a serious Jew. And this is a mitzvah which can be and must be performed wherever a Jew lives, in all times, in all places. And again, despite having said that, Chazal say that Awirat Eretz Yisrael Machkim, the as it were, the air of Eretz Yisrael makes one wiser, one increases one's understanding and one's depth of understanding, and also connection to the Torah. The understanding and learning and connection to Torah, and therefore to Hashem, that is possible in Eretz Yisrael is greater than that which is achievable outside Eretz Yisrael. So all these things are connected. These are some of the mitzvot that Chazal single out. But it should not be understood that a person can opt to perform this or that mitzvah because it happens to appeal to them, whereas another mitzvah which they perhaps do not understand very well or are not used to is somehow less less important. That would be a grave error. I have a feeling that there's another shiur scheduled to begin very shortly. Am I right?
Repeat that?
Am I correct in thinking that another shiur is scheduled to begin shortly?
No.
No? No other shiurim scheduled this evening?
Yes, there was one or not.
I'm sorry? I'm sorry?
There was only one per not.
I see. I understand. All right. Very well. So we have time for another question, and then perhaps we'll wrap things up.
Shalom, it's Chaim.
Shalom.
I was wondering, for the mitzvah of Chibut Arava this Friday, is there, regarding that, is there, first of all, a minimum amount of Arvavot, and is there a bracha that one should make, that one may make?
There is no minimum amount and no maximal amount. The minimal shiur is even one stick of arava with even one leaf on it. Afilu ba'd ehad, afilu alei ehad, so it says. But obviously it looks rather, how shall we say, rather stingy and poor to perform a mitzvah with a stick of arava that has barely one leaf on it. But if that's what one has, that's what one does. But there are various customs. Some take 3, usually the freshest, nicest looking stalks of arava that one can find. 3, some take 5, some take more, and they can be and should be bound together, either with another stalk of arava or with a piece of lulav or something like that. With regards to the bracha, or lack thereof, this is a mahaloket as it happens between the Talmud Bavli and the Talmud Yerushalmi. Although even with regards to the Talmud Bavli, there is more than one opinion how to understand the Talmud Bavli, but the usual understanding, such as Rambam's understanding of the Talmud Bavli's position, is that there is no bracha for the mitzvah of Hibut Arava, which is an unusual and somewhat mysterious mitzvah, one must admit. It is a minhag nevi'im, as the Gemara says, and it was brought back from Bavel by the latter-day Nevi'im when they returned to Eretz Yisrael, the beginning of Beit Sheni, the beginning of the Second Temple period. According to Talmud Bavli, there is no bracha to be said. In the Talmud Yerushalmi, we find that one Chacham asks another, what bracha does one say on this mitzvah? So apparently there were those who did say a bracha. So according to the Talmud Yerushalmi, one does make a bracha. The nusach of the bracha is not explicitly mentioned there, but one imagines that the bracha would be Asher Kiddushanu v'mitzvoto v'siwanu al hibut arava. All right. I think we'll wrap things up at this point, and I wish all of you, wherever you may be, Hag Sameach. May we all be zocheh to mekayem the mitzvah of Sukkah and all the regalim and all the mitzvot b'simcha tamid. May all our days be b'vchinat Zman Simchatenu. Shana Tova v'Hag Sameach.
Amen.
Amen.
Do you mind, Rav, if I ask a very short question, which
Yes.
will have a very short answer, I expect?
All right.
If we can make coffee on Shabbat with Turkish coffee, what they call cafe bots, when you put boiling hot water directly onto the coffee? Because I heard different opinions.
All right. There are those who say that you may do so. I personally can, for the life of me, understand such an opinion, because what's called Turkish coffee is simply coffee beans that were ground into powder and were never cooked in hot water. They were roasted. You can also actually make coffee from unroasted coffee beans. I have tasted such coffee. Tenmanim have such a beverage, but normally roasting improves the flavor of the beans, similar to many nuts where we roast them to enhance the flavor. But it is not in hot water. The Mishnah states for Shabbat, that which has not come into contact with hot water before Shabbat may not be brought into contact with very hot water on Shabbat.
Oh wow!
And this means, in simple terms, that taking Turkish coffee and either placing it into very hot water or pouring very hot water over it is cooking it for the first time. It was never cooked before. It was roasted, but roasting is a different process from cooking. The claim, in my mind at least, the claim that roasting and cooking are one and the same, and if something has been roasted, it is therefore also considered to have been cooked. This is untrue. It is true that there is a discussion. It's also the general opinion is that even with things like meat, the yesh bishul hatzali, there is bishul, there can be cooking after roasting and vice versa. In other words, you can take a piece of meat, shall we say a steak, and you can put it on the barbecue, which is called roasting. That's called sali. And normally you would just go ahead and eat it. But if you wanted to, you could also go after that. You could stew it. You could put it in a pot with liquid. Yeah. There's a difference between sali, which is without liquid, and bishul, which is with liquid. And you could cook it. And these are two processes. And you would be hayav on Shabbat for cooking after sali or doing sali after bishul. There's the Bala Yira'im, one of the Rishonim, and this is a generally accepted position when it comes to Chod Shabbat. And it's logical that it should be so. It's logical that it should be so, even with regards to meat, even though the roasted steak is entirely edible. It doesn't have to be cooked now in water or sauce in order to be edible. It's entirely edible. If you want to go ahead and cook it in addition to the roasting, and some people might say ruin it in addition to the roasting, then you can do that, but it's certainly edible. When it comes to Turkish coffee, it is not so. Coffee that has not been brewed in hot water is inedible. It is not ra'ui la'achila. You cannot do anything with it. If you take Turkish coffee and put it in cold water, what do you get? You get something totally. You get dark, murky water, which is totally unpalatable. It's not coffee. It's not coffee. The fact that it was roasted doesn't change the fact that now, having put it into cold or even lukewarm water, will not turn it into a beverage that we refer to as coffee. But the moment you put it into hot water, even if the water is not really boiling, let's say it's 80 degrees or more, maybe even 65 degrees might be sufficient, I think, Celsius, but certainly 80 degrees or more, you do get coffee out of it. It's true, if the water is boiling, it's better. But if the water's quite hot, you will get a beverage, something which is drinkable, palatable, called coffee. So if you do that on Shabbat, you're actually cooking that coffee on Shabbat, and that is Simchat Torah, as far as I can understand the matter. And therefore, I truly do not understand those who say that you can prepare that kind of coffee on Shabbat. So to sum up, if you wish to make coffee on Shabbat, you can either do one of the following things. You can either drink instant coffee, which has already been cooked in hot water and then was dried. That's why it's instant coffee. That's why it's instant. And that's why you can even add instant coffee to cold water and you will still get coffee. It'll be cold, it'll be iced coffee perhaps, but it's coffee because it was cooked already and then it was freeze-dried. Or you can prepare Turkish or espresso coffee or with a coffee, with a plunger, with a French press. You can prepare coffee. I sometimes do this before Shabbat. And then you can, and if you make it, shall we say, quite concentrated and strong, you can use it as a concentrated coffee on Shabbat by adding it to hot water. It's already been cooked. And now this also is a machloket, according to Rashi, or what can be understood from Rashi. It's not actually before Rashi and Rashi. What can be understood from Rashi, as the Rosh writes, that if something is liquid and it's cold, even if it was cooked, you cannot heat it up again on Shabbat. But here I am mekel, according to what, for a number of reasons, the Rambam's position, the position of the Ran and others, is that if something was cooked, even if it's now cold, it may be heated up. So you can heat up, according to this, you could heat up cold chicken soup on Shabbat, as the Temanim do, for example, and you can heat up cold coffee or tea on Shabbat because it was already cooked. So here you could place some of that concentrated coffee that you made Erev Shabbat into a cup, add hot water to it, and you'll have a good cup of coffee.
Great, that's very good to know. Thank you so much.
Very well.
Also, does there have time for one more question?
Yes.
Regarding Hoshanot, what's the custom of walking around the Beth HaKnesset every day, and on the Hoshana Rabbah, walking around 7 times, and saying all these piyutim? Is that a minhag? Is there like more significance to that, or like how important is it to do that? Say the piyutim, go around.
It is clearly a minhag. It's without doubt can be classified and should be classified as a minhag. The basis of the minhag is very precious and important on the one hand. In other words, it is a zecher HaMikdash, because this is what was done in the Beth HaMikdash when the Mikdash stood. The Kohanim and others went. The Kohanim went around made circuits around the Mizbeach with Lulavim and Arvavot, etc. And what we're doing is a zecher HaMikdash, and the concept of zecher HaMikdash, doing things to connect with that which was, so that we do not forget that which was. So, and the main reason not to forget that which was is so that we will be motivated and understand and know about these things, so that we'll be able to do these things and make them a reality once again. It's not just an exercise in historical memory. It is mainly an exercise, as many things that we do, like Tisha B'Av. We don't fast on Tisha B'Av simply to remember that there was once a Mikdash. We fast on Tisha B'Av to remember that there was a Mikdash and that there should be and must be a Mikdash, and therefore we have to build it and do it and make it a reality. And at that point, when we make it a reality, we will no longer fast on Tisha B'Av. And the same is true of the Mikdash. So there is value to this practice on the one hand. On the other hand, the reciting of piyutim, which are incomprehensible or somewhat incomprehensible to most people, especially if they are quite lengthy, is a problem. Whenever you do something in a shul setting, a Beth Knesset setting, to which people cannot really relate, or they cannot really understand what's going on, this will inevitably, as Rambam and the Ramah with the Hay and the Balaturim write, this will inevitably lead to people talking and losing focus and doing things they should not be doing in the Beth Knesset. So really, such minhagim need to be considered and modulated in such a way that they are comprehensible and meaningful to the people doing them. That's one thing I would point out. Another thing I would point out is that Am Yisrael, throughout the very lengthy Galuth, clearly and obviously was to a greater or lesser extent in a state of mourning. Even on Hagim, Am Yisrael was in a state of mourning. The Galuth in most parts of the world, at least in certain periods of history, was was very bitter and disheartening, to say the least. Sometimes downright terrifying. Often the Jews felt that their lives hung by a thread, and they thought and felt this for good reason. So that many of these piyutim, the ones that you're referring to, but also the ones that are said on other occasions during the year, are bemoaning the reality of the galuth in Chutz La'aretz. Now, for us to repeat those same piyutim, which are in many ways kinoth, in other words, it's almost like saying kinoth of Tisha B'Av on Sukkoth, which is a time which is supposed to be, as we said, Zman Simchatenu, and it's a sort to mit'abel, to mourn and to be sad on a Chag. But the overwhelming reality of the Jews in Chutz La'aretz was galuth and mourning and sadness and downright terror, and therefore this came to the fore and was expressed in these piyutim in these times of year, and including Sukkoth, unfortunately. So many of the piyutim that are recited today really have no place today. They are referring to an historical reality which is, thank God, behind us. Behind us in terms of Jews who live in Eretz Yisrael, and also, Baruch Hashem, behind us in terms of Jews who still live overseas. One cannot compare the reality of a Jew living in medieval Germany in the 12th century, Leminyanam, shall we say, the reality with which they confronted on a daily basis. One cannot compare that to the reality of a Jew who today lives in Los Angeles or Melbourne or Antwerp, for that matter. Are there anti-Semites in the world? Yes, of course there are. Have there always been? Yes. Will there always be? Yes, there will be. That's not new. But that doesn't mean that reality has not changed very significantly. Is it possible that anti-Semitism is on the rise in various parts of the world today? I think it's not only possible, it's even a factual reality. But again, that's not unusual, but it hasn't reached the levels which I think would warrant repeating those same kinds of statements that the Paitanim in 12th century Germany or if one thinks about realities in the Ukraine or Russia 400 years ago, 300 years ago. One thinks about the Khmelnytsky massacres, Tach V'Tat, 1648, 1649. Those kinds of realities are so removed from our reality, Baruch Hashem, to repeat those same statements, those same kinoth, and sometimes referred to as piyutim, but some of them are actually kinoth, I think is out of place. So the focus of such piyutim on Sukkoth, which we recite when circuiting the Bama, which is a Zecher Amigdash, should be on the Ikar of Sukkoth, which is praying for rain. Bahag Nidonim al Hamayim. During Sukkoth, the rainy season of Eretz Yisrael, the din with regards to the coming rainy season, whether it will be sufficient, whether it will be a year of drought or plentiful rain, is decided at the time of Sukkoth. And this is something, again, which is unique to Eretz Yisrael. One can only understand the concept of Bahag Nidonim al Hamayim when one understands and lives in Eretz Yisrael. If one lives in a country where it rains every third day on average, one has no conception or no understanding of what these statements and what these tefillot are all about. And again, this simply reinforces the fact that the Torah was designed for and is predicated upon the assumption that we're talking about Jews living in Eretz Yisrael. Everything else is some kind of substitute or aberration, and that's something that we all have to keep in mind.
Does the Rav have a nusach to say? Like, has anyone wrote one of these things to say about the rain?
There are some such Hoshanot written by Rav Saadia Gaon and others in earlier periods, which I think are more appropriate. And of course, we can and should probably be authoring and writing such things today, and this is possible. And there are people who have the talent and the knowledge to do that. I don't have a specific nusach to offer you right now. I can tell you, if you look in Sidur of Saadia Gaon, you will find some such piyutim that I think are appropriate.
Thank you.
All right, my friends, I wish you all again Hag Sameach, and may we all, Bezrat Hashem, experience a better year than has been the case for most of us this past year, which has been a very unusual and difficult year, and we're not out of the woods yet, I know. Whether the response and the reaction to this virus has been measured and reasonable is an interesting debate, which I think can and should be had, but now's not the time. But the fact is, we are all living through unusual and very challenging times, and may Hashem give us the strength and the wisdom to endure and prosper despite these difficulties.
Amen.
Shalom, Chag Sameach.
Thank you so much. Amen.
Thank you, Rav.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.